History remembers its deadliest warriors for the men they killed. It rarely remembers how they died. Some of those deaths were stranger than anything they ever did on a battlefield. A few were killed by their own side, ambushed by the very people they had spent a lifetime defending. One fought a decisive battle after his heart had already stopped beating. One aimed a single arrow while completely blind and guided by nothing but a coded poem. One chose his own execution rather than accept a pardon. One was murdered by a boy with a crossbow, forgave him with his final breath, and was avenged anyway against his own explicit wishes. These are 8 of the strangest deaths in military history, drawn from Rome, medieval Spain, India, the Aztec Empire, Southern Africa, New Zealand, Crusader France, and the Ottoman frontier. Every one of them is documented, and several were considered too strange to be believed even by the people who recorded them. Ancient Rome, around 450 BCE. Lucius Dentatus had survived over 120 battles across several decades of continuous warfare for the Roman Republic. He carried 45 wounds on the front of his body, and not one on his back, a detail Roman writers repeated specifically because it meant he had never once turned to run. He had won 8 single combats against enemy champions and collected so many crowns, spears, and ceremonial torques that he could barely wear them all at once during a parade. By his 60s, he was less a soldier than a living monument, and that made him dangerous to the wrong kind of politician. The corrupt magistrate Appius Claudius saw Dentatus not as an asset to Rome, but as a rival too respected to control. So Claudius sent the old veteran out on a fake scouting mission, escorted by a small handful of soldiers who had been secretly ordered to kill him along the way. In a narrow ravine, they sprang the ambush. Dentatus fought back anyway. He cut down 8 of his own escort with his bare sword before the survivors could pin him down. Unable to beat him in a straight fight, they scrambled up the slopes above him instead and buried him under a rain of stones and javelins, killing him the way you would kill something too dangerous to approach. When his body was finally recovered, the corpses of his murderers were lying in a circle beside it. Rome's most decorated living soldier was not killed by an enemy army. He was killed by his own government because surviving that many wars had made him untouchable in exactly the wrong way. Medieval Spain, July 10th, 1099. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known as El Cid, had built a career on never losing. He had carved out his own principality in the city of Valencia and held it against the Almoravid Empire, one of the largest and most disciplined Muslim powers in North Africa at the time. When the Almoravids returned to besiege Valencia one final time, El Cid was 56 years old, and the siege did what 30 years of combat never managed. He died inside the city walls, worn down by illness and famine rather than by a blade. According to the legend that followed almost immediately, his wife Jimena refused to let his death end the fight before it had to. She had his corpse dressed in full armor, strapped upright onto his warhorse Babieca, and sent out through the gates at the head of his own troops at dawn. The besieging soldiers, seeing the general they believed unkillable riding toward them once again in the morning light, broke formation and fled without a fight. Historians today doubt the story happened exactly as written down. It survived anyway because it captured something true about the man. El Cid's most famous victory was the one he supposedly won after he was already dead. Northern India, February 1192. Prithviraj Chauhan had already humiliated the invading general Muhammad of Ghor once, driving him wounded off the field at the first battle of Terrain the year before. Muhammad returned with a much larger force, and this time a dawn surprise attack shattered Chauhan's army before it could properly form. The king was captured and dragged back in chains to the Ghurid capital. According to the legend that Indian oral tradition has carried for centuries, his captors blinded him with hot iron rods, then paraded him out to perform trick archery for their own amusement, mocking a king who could no longer see his own target. What they had not accounted for was his court poet, Chand Bardai, who was permitted to stand beside him during the display. The poet recited a single verse, disguised as ordinary praise, that secretly encoded the exact distance and direction of the Sultan's seat. Guided by nothing but the sound of that voice, the blind king drew his bow and released a single arrow. It struck Muhammad of Ghor dead on the spot. Knowing exactly what their own execution would look like afterward, Chauhan and his poet then turned their blades on each other, denying their captors the satisfaction of doing it themselves. Most professional historians believe Chauhan was simply executed in captivity, with no arrow and no final act of defiance. The arrow is the version India has never once let go of. The Aztec Empire, 1518. Tlahuicole was the most feared general of Tlaxcala, a kingdom the Aztecs had never managed to conquer. When he was finally captured in battle, Emperor Moctezuma did something almost unheard of for a prisoner of his stature. He offered Tlahuicole his freedom, his wealth, and safe passage home. Tlahuicole refused. In Tlaxcalan custom, a captured warrior who simply walked home alive lived the rest of his life in disgrace. So instead, he asked for the death reserved for the empire's bravest prisoners, the gladiatorial sacrifice. He was tethered by one ankle to a massive stone disc so he could not flee, handed a war club edged with soft feathers instead of razor-sharp obsidian, and set against a relentless succession of the empire's elite eagle and jaguar warriors, all of them armed for real. Anchored to that stone, he still killed several of them outright, and wounded more than 20 before he was finally brought down. Only then was he carried to the sacrificial altar. He had chosen that death freely over the shame of simply surviving. Southern Africa, September 22, 1828. Shaka kaSenzangakona had built the Zulu kingdom from a minor clan of 1,500 people into an empire that dominated the region, using military reforms no one in southern Africa had seen before. But after his mother Nandi died in 1827, his grief curdled into something closer to a reign of terror, and his own inner circle decided he had become unbearable to serve. On the morning of September 22nd, with most of the Zulu army deployed far to the north, his half-brothers Dingane and Muhlangana caught him virtually unguarded and stabbed him to death. As he lay dying, Shaka is said to have looked up at the men who had just killed him and delivered a final warning instead of a plea. He told them that they would never truly rule the land they had just taken from him, because pale people would soon come up out of the sea and take it from all of them instead. His body was dumped into an empty grain pit. Within a lifetime, colonial powers had indeed swallowed the kingdom whole. New Zealand, January 1827. Hongi Hika had transformed Maori warfare almost single-handedly, arming the Ngapuhi people with European muskets on a scale no rival tribe could match. During a minor skirmish at Hokianga, a warrior named Maratea shot him clean through the chest. By any normal measure, that wound should have killed him within days. It did not. Hongi Hika lived another 14 months with an open hole in his lung, and rather than hide the injury, he turned it into a spectacle. He invited visitors to lean in and listen to the wind whistle through his own chest each time he exhaled, and some claimed they could see clean through him when he stood in the light. He kept planning campaigns almost to the end, still scheming to capture a strategic anchorage on the coast. The wound finally turned septic, and he died of the infection on March 6, 1828. His final resting place was kept a secret to protect it from being disturbed. For 14 months, one of the most feared war leaders in New Zealand's history quite literally breathed with a hole clean through him and made sure everyone around him could hear it. France, March 1199. Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader King of England, had spent his entire life leading from the front. That habit finally caught up with him at a siege so minor it barely deserved the name, over a dispute about treasure a peasant had supposedly dug up on his land. One evening, walking the perimeter of the castle without his full armor, Richard found himself admiring the nerve of a lone defender on the walls who kept shooting at him. That same defender, reportedly a boy, put a crossbow bolt straight into his shoulder. The wound alone should not have been fatal. An unskilled surgeon botched the extraction, and the arm rotted with gangrene. As Richard lay dying, he had the boy brought before him, and in a final act completely out of character for a man of his reputation, he pardoned him. His mercenary captain did not share the sentiment. The moment Richard died days later, that captain had the boy flayed alive and then hanged anyway, in direct defiance of the king's dying wish. The most famous warrior king in English history died over a rumor of buried treasure and was avenged against his own explicit orders. Albania, January 17, 1468. George Castriati, known to history as Skanderbeg, had held off the entire Ottoman Empire for 25 straight years with an army that rarely numbered more than 10,000 men. No Ottoman force ever managed to kill him in battle. In the end, it was not a soldier that finished him. It was malaria, contracted during a routine campaign that took him at the age of 62 in the town of Leja. Ottoman resistance in Albania collapsed within a decade of his death, but the Ottomans were still not finished with him. According to widely repeated accounts, when their soldiers eventually located his grave, they dug it open and stripped his skeleton apart, carrying off fragments of bone to wear as amulets. They believed that carrying a piece of the one man who had beaten them for 25 years might pass some of that fortune on to whoever wore it. The empire that could never kill Skanderbeg in life spent years afterward trying to inherit his courage from his bones.